Good week, folks. Thanks for coming to Find One for our song. I'm Matthew Brown, your host. I'm taking another week off. This week, I'm bringing back one of my favorites, specifically around defunding the police and why it actually isn't all that scary. I hope you enjoy. I hope you're learning, particularly as we see conservatives running scare tactics around a recent uptick in crime that fully funded police departments are not and did not prevent. They ignore tactics and preventative measures and things that actually interrupt violence. So I hope you learn, listen, enjoy, hit subscribe, share, and all that fun jazz, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks for coming. Bye.
All right, well, welcome, folks. Welcome to Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. My name is Matthew Brown, and I'm going to be your host today again. And today we're going to be talking specifically about police, right? And talking a little bit about their history, a little bit about how effective they are and their role in society, as well as walking through a bit of that defund, abolition, and the difference between reform. And these are important things. These are hard things to get comfortable with, particularly in how ingrained we are of this mythology of police, of, these good guys and mostly good institution protecting us and being that thin blue line between order and chaos, right? That's the myth of police. And I'm here to tell you that myth is not true. And in fact, police have often been part of the chaos that they claim they are opposed to, particularly racial chaos. I'm going to be reference episode 2 a bit, where I talk through a brief history of racial violence within the United States. And in that, in every single instance, you had either police officers taking part in race riots of white mobs going in and killing and lynching black people, or sitting on the sidelines. And this happened all across the nation. Or you can talk about sundown towns, right? And police taking part in sundown towns that all across Madison is surrounded by sundown towns, right? Of where if you're black, you do not want to be found there. You'd be arrested or killed. You could be disappeared. Or you can look at Chicago PD and their history of torture sites. There's a long list of real grievances, real criticism of police taking part in very, very real violence. And even police in themselves are violent, innately violent. They use the threat of violence to enforce order, or an unjust order, right? So police in even their history and how they originated in this country were to be that of enforcing unjust laws, of enforcing a racial and class order in the society. Some of the earliest professionalizations of police we see are as slave catchers. And this wasn't just in the South. This was all across the country, particularly when the Fugitive Slave Act was enacted, and basically deputized all white people, and deputized particularly all police as slave catchers across the country. And then as the expansion westward was particularly racist, particularly in the post-Civil War, where you saw that as a lot of the ideas of the Confederacy blossomed in a real way out west of this, of maintaining this racial order, right? And you saw that in law enforcement, particularly, again, out west. So these things it's not just the South or the former Confederate states. And actually, there are slave states that took in the North. I think it was Maryland. I'm blanking out right now. In the part of the Civil War, right? So as these things developed, right, police grew more and more to enforce the color line within the United States, be it taking part in racial violence or enforcing Jim Crow laws or vagrancy laws, which were created to, again, help maintain the racial order, disproportionately targeting black people. There's legacies of that, such as our drug war and drug laws, and we still see some stuff within vagrancy laws that target poor people, and those that are experiencing homelessness and home loss right now. and how they're targeted and enforced. And they are predominantly Black and other people of color, as well as our veterans, right? But we know that, again, the drug war was started with very real racist intent, not just in outcome, but very real racist intent to target Black Americans, and not, as well as other leftist organizations, and break them up. And it's expanded and blew up. All right. So these are racist laws. We also know through the history of the labor movement that police were often on the side of management and breaking strikes. Not on the side of labor, not on the side of creating better working conditions, making it so that you, as part of labor, because most of us are part of labor, could better support your family, could have a better life, right? And not be quasi-indentured servants, right? And not working to death, right? And these are things we're still fighting for, but more often than not, they were on the side of management and breaking these strikes and beating back these things, right? Their primary role in society has been, again, to enforce unjust laws and an unjust order, and to support the wealthy aristocrats and their wants, right? And they still do that when it comes to evictions, and in a lot of real ways, right? And that's their role in society. That's their main role in society, and how they behave, particularly towards wealthy people, is real. And we still see that when we see people, particularly Black people, that are in neighborhoods that they so-called don't belong in, even if they live there, and how police are called there to enforce the color line. And it's tragic, right? But again, we're thought to see them in a very specific way. Some of this is actually Hoover's fault with the FBI, where in movies early on, it was gangsters were glorified in a real way. And Hoover intervened and started glorifying the FBI and this righteous fight. Now, if you know anything about the history of the FBI, it is enormously corrupt, particularly in its racism. And so that's where we start to see the rise of this glorification of police, right? Of these just folks enforcing this law and order and blah, 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 blah. But we have to break past that. We have to break past this myth. And as we think about this, we have to think about, again, continuing police role in society. Most of what they respond to aren't actually even crimes. It's interpersonal conflict. It's somebody lonely. It's a mental health issue, right? Where somebody might be, having a mental health crisis or emotional health crisis in a different way, right? Facing stress, and they send in somebody armed that isn't a professional in dealing with this, and too often somebody ends up killed, and too often it's not the police officer. Not too often. Sorry, I don't want to insinuate anybody's died, but when I say too often somebody's killed, I meant that it's not the police officer in most of those instances. Very much, no matter who you are, I don't want to see you die. All right. So most of what they do isn't actually even engaging or solving crime. So this law, when you watch Law and Order, that's not what most of their time actually is spent on. Most violent and property crimes aren't even reported to police. So most reported crimes aren't even solved. Some of the most recent data on this from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, BJS, from 2015, where they say, and they've done studies on this, majority of violent crime and property crime goes unreported. Police also don't solve the social conditions that are asked to respond to, such as poverty, lack of affordable housing, food, education, right? Things that impact our ability to engage and healthily engage in society. They are a response unit. They don't solve these problems. We can't lock away these problems as much as some folks might want to. That just doesn't work. That's what we've been doing. And yet here we are. We're still where we are. And police budgets haven't been cut. Police haven't been defunded. Violent crime over the last 30 years has been on a steady decline, right? And there's been plenty of studies, such as the Justice Policy Institute, that show that more police don't necessarily reduce crime, right? These COPS grants they talk about don't necessarily reduce crime, and their impact is questionable. Places with fewer police actually seem to be safer at times than cities with more police. How we have to think of this, as in particularly in the context of race, is that often crime is used to justify more police. When you add more police, you see more crime, and then it becomes a vicious cycle instead of, again, solving poverty. And this was in episode 2, particularly violent crime, it seems unemployment is the biggest driver of violent crime than anything. And so there's statistics out there that show Black people commit most of the violent crimes, but they're also, suffering the most unemployment in this country, and concentrated unemployment. And when you adjust for unemployment rates, Black and white people commit similarly same rate of violent crime, right? Again, going back to episode 2, if you want to learn a lot more about violence and looting and how all this plays particularly into policing. So it creates this feedback loop of this, and within our mentality, and of ever increasing budgets. And again, violent crime's been declining, crime's been declining, yet this narrative of this brink of chaos in society is constantly there. Most people actually believe crime is steadily rising, not declining, right? So we have to, again, break through these myths that we believe as a society, not everybody, but in general, that are going on. And we think about it, the safest neighborhoods, what do they have? Think about the safest neighborhoods. Do they have more police? Do they have police on every corner, patrolling all the time? Or do they have secure housing, access to food, transportation, other resources, green space, healthcare, right? Access to these things that we need. Access to their humanity, right? But again, are police even effective in what they do? All right. Some our latest FBI data from 2018 shows again, think about this, in most crimes, violent and property crimes go unreported. So we know this. So they're not even responding to most crimes. So this is those that are reported. Violent crime clearance rates of reported violent crime is 45.5%. To put it another way, about 55% of violent crime goes unsolved. 62% of murders are cleared / solved. To put it another way, about 40%, you have about a 40% chance of getting away with murder in this country. 33% of rapes are cleared, right? And then property crime clearance is 17.6%. Enormously low. So if you have something stolen, probably not going to be solved, right? And again, we know most crime is a crime of opportunity as well as a crime of poverty, meaning if they weren't in these social conditions, they would not have committed that crime in the first place. So if we solve some of these larger social conditions, these things will massively decrease. Now, there's always going to be, rebellious teenagers and so on and so forth. But let's try, and again, this comes down to addressing larger issues, and then, what's left behind, we can start addressing those things on an individual basis. Let's keep that in mind here. In Madison, things are a little bit different, with a 60% clearance rate on violent crime, right? Higher than most, and this is 2019 data, and with 4 murders last year, 4 with 100% clearance rate. But again, we can cherry pick statistics, and looking at localities is important, but we need to think of the macro, right, and not outliers, because Madison isn't in a vacuum. It's not this special city. It faces the same problems as every city, and I wish I looked at historical data, because I'm betting there'd be ups and downs in clearance rates, and now we need to look, and we need to identify kind of longer term trends, not just a single year snapshot, right? Even with the FBI stuff, but that stuff again is longer term trends as we think about it. Property crime clearance is 17% for Madison, and 42% of forcible rape is cleared in Madison. And again, so things aren't necessarily always great. And we have such a small low amount of murders that it becomes a little bit easier, right? When you're smaller, again, it's very, very small sample size compared to nationally in other cities. So again, we have to kind of think of these things holistically, particularly when we think of federal budgets and state budgets and how these things impact each other. So police on a whole aren't actually that good at doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're not stopping most crime. They're not preventing most crime. Most crime goes unreported. And most crime they respond to, they're not even solving. So what do we do? In Madison, the Madison Police Department takes up about 30% of its annual operational budget, right? You look at elsewhere, Baltimore, it's like 60% of its annual operational budget. Baltimore has a hard time heating its schools in the winter. So what do we do? And this is where kind of that defund comes in. Is the police and carceral state is massively expensive. And it takes a lot of money, a lot of resources to maintain these infrastructures, from training, equipment, so on and so forth down the line. And this is the crux of the defund. If most of what they respond to isn't crime, doesn't it make sense to have folks that are professionals in dealing with those social situations, such as domestic violence, arguments in general, mental health, emotional health crises, address those things, right? Create, and that's part of it. One of the 177 recommendations from the Police Policy and Procedure Ad Hoc Committee, full disclosure, I was on it, was the creation of a mental health first response unit. And that's a step in that direction. That's a step in that defund, right? So let's uncouple some of these things that they do that they're not the best people to equip to do, right? And that means they have more resources, more ability to concentrate on, well, potentially solving actual crime. That is some of really kind of core aspects of defund, removing these extra things that we ask them to do that they're not actually good at doing and could potentially be harmful and lead to somebody's death, such as Tony Robinson. The call was a known mental health crisis. Known. His friends thought in calling 911, they're going to get him help. It's, alcohol and drug-induced crisis, but a crisis nonetheless. Drugs shouldn't be a death sentence. A crisis shouldn't be a death sentence. Not obeying an officer shouldn't be a death sentence. All right, petty theft shouldn't be a death sentence. So no crime should be a death sentence by police. And so they responded. His life would have been saved if we had a mental health first response unit that would have went in instead of police to handle the situation, that was trained to handle the situation. Our police aren't properly trained to do that because that's not really their job. And it's tragic. So that's, again, like, it's not just scary of we don't have anybody to respond to these things. It's about putting those best trained to respond to things that we need them to respond to, right? And there might be other ways and more radical ways to rethink enforcing social contracts and laws in this country, particularly when it comes to property crime and theft. And this comes from seeing the humanity in both the victim as well as the perpetrator, right? And not trying to take away somebody's humanity, right? Because all you might do in causing somebody harm that caused you harm is just causing more harm and keeping that cycle going. We know our jail and prison system is deeply inhumane. We know our criminal justice system is deeply inhumane and does a very, very poor job of actually rehabilitating anybody to get back into society, to give them proper tools and proper healing, right? Because a lot of times you can see and you dig through these people's histories, there's a lot of harm that was already being done to them. Now, that doesn't excuse them of their behavior, but it just means causing more harm isn't necessarily the answer. We have to find a way for them to heal and find their humanity, right? Taking away their humanity isn't the answer in this. It doesn't work. The numbers tell us it doesn't work, all right? We're spending all this money on something that doesn't work, that does nothing but strip people out of humanity, puts them back into society, that continues to punish them after they leave jail, making it harder to find jobs and housing and opportunities, continually dehumanizing them. All right. So we don't need all the police that we have because of going and most of what they do just doesn't work. They don't address crime. So we need to start defunding and start investing in mental health resources, housing, education, and things that have been constantly defunded. These things have been historically defunded over the last 30 years, right? Better employment opportunities, raising the minimum wage, right? Reducing unemployment, healthcare. I mean, like just down the line. And when it comes to violence, we also know that violence spreads a lot like a virus does, right? This has, again, been studied. And organizations like Cities United and Madison's own Violent Interruption Coalition do a much better job of interrupting and stopping the spread of violence. And these things are massive. These organizations are massively under-resourced, particularly when we compare them to law enforcement, right? So they're much better equipped at stopping violence in its track, not just responding to it, but preventing future violence, right? There's a lot of data to back this up. Cities United does a pretty good work, and they work with law enforcement too in this. But law enforcement isn't stopping the violence, right? We still have it. And they're much more well-funded than any of these other organizations that interrupt the violence and are much more effective in doing it. Police haven't been defunded. They're not stopping violence. They're just not. The data just isn't there. Again, like there's just, it just doesn't back it up, right? And I know logical arguments don't always do this, but we have to push past this uncomfort that you might have within this and try to understand, well, what is the institution then? So how do we get to this understanding? Let's think about this, right? They're created to maintain a racial order as an institution. Slavery was an institution that was built to maintain a racial order. It doesn't effectively address the social issues they respond to. So it's a known racist organization, that will willingly enforce, a known institution, I should say, willingly enforce unjust laws oftentimes passed to target Black Americans and poor Americans. In a society that doesn't help people find adequate housing, jobs, healthcare, mental health, and other resources to better build themselves and their family and support their family. So if those are things that we know, why do we continue to massively invest in this institution? Why do we continue to believe that there's something that they're not? When there are better ways to address violent crime, when they're not effectively even addressing violent crime themselves. We have to radically rethink these things. And that's where, that line to abolition starts coming in, is really in radically reinforcing or radically reimagining what support of victims as well as the perpetrator can be. I don't believe it's perfect, but I try and understand where they're coming from. All right. And I don't think they answer all the questions that a lot of us have, but it's a start. And it's better than doubling down on something that we know doesn't work. Right. And it becomes very hard for us to break our habits as individuals, as a society, and things that we're led to believe and push past those uncomfort thoughts and processes. So let me just challenge you to, instead of this reaction of oh, no, we can't defund. And what about this? What about that violent crime? Well, let's push past that, right? Just kind of sit with that discomfort for a little while and start looking, at the data or stories and reading through a bit more. And even just let your own mind and imagination kind of run maybe a little bit more wild on this and think about different ways to enforce these things. You want somebody to see your humanity if you do something, right? Well, if you're put into a tough situation, you want somebody to see your humanity too, right? So let's see others' humanity in this. And let's try to find ways that we can further heal ourselves and support one another. Because even if you're not on abolition, investing in all these other things and leaving police to actually investigate crimes more often, particularly violent crimes, or real property crimes, potentially, by leaving them space so they're not responding to all these other things, they can do that better. It'll be a smaller police force, more focused, and better off for it, right? In that sense, less people will be in danger. So let's think through that. Let's push through that. All right. So thanks for joining us to Finding the Warmth for Our Sons. Catch us every Wednesday here at Madison 365. You can also, just make sure you hit subscribe at YouTube, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. All right. Hit subscribe, 5-star review if you like. Well, at least I hope you do. And again, join us every Wednesday here. Thanks for being here with us. And again, sit with that discomfort for a little bit. I'm your host, Matthew Brown, and I hope you have a lovely day.
This is 365 Media.